Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're standing thousands of years ago, sun beating down. You're not just holding a spear, maybe, but you're crafting something really intricate, a bow and arrow, maybe mixing some special glue or even poison.
Right.
Then you're out, trekking, scanning the horizon, reading these tiny signs on the ground, maybe coordinating silently with someone else, all while keeping track of the wind, the distant animal.
Yeah, the focus involved.
And then finally, the shot, the single precise movement demanding incredible focus, integrating, I don't know, everything from your hands and body to that target way off in the distance. How did our ancestors even master that?
It's an amazing image. And what kind of intense mental control did that take? You know, the multitasking.
Exactly. And here's the really surprising twist we're getting into today.
Yeah.
Could something as complex, but maybe seemingly simple, like hunting with a bow and arrow, could that have actually helped change our brains over time?
That really sets the stage perfectly for this deep dive. We're exploring a really fascinating idea from some recent research. It's about this potential coevolutionary link between complex ancient technologies, bow hunting in particular,
Okay.
the development of a specific part of our brain, the precuneus, and this unique human capacity for what researchers are calling complex attention.
And this isn't just like a neat theory pulled out of thin air. The paper we're diving into, it pulls from so many fields, archaeology, obviously, looking at tools, paleoneurology, studying brain evolution, neurogenetics, so changes in our genes, and even modern Kalahari ethnography, studying living hunter-gatherers to maybe understand past practices.
Yeah, the main source is From Complex Techno-Behavior to Complex Attention Through the Genes of the Precuneus by Marlize Lombard. It's quite recent in the Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory.
So our mission here is to kind of navigate all this interdisciplinary work, pull out the core insights for you. The paper basically argues that technologies like bow hunting, they weren't just proof of advanced human thinking.
Right, not just a result.
But they might have actually been a driver of brain changes, helping shape this precuneus region and maybe giving Homo sapiens, us, a unique edge and complex attention compared to, say, Neanderthals or Denisovans.
Exactly. It's like a shortcut to understanding this really cutting-edge research and, what it might imply about what makes our minds specifically human.
Okay, so let's start with that idea of complexity. The paper brings up Herbert Simon's definition, I think. A complex system is essentially one with lots of parts interacting in ways that aren't simple. You can't easily predict the whole just by looking at the individual parts.
Right. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, pragmatically speaking. You can't just infer the whole system easily.
And they apply this idea to complex techno-behavior. So it's not just making a tool or using a tool.
No, it's a whole system. It involves multiple steps, different materials, knowledge, all interacting over time and space in ways that are non-trivial. Think of it like a long-term project with lots of interconnected phases.
Which brings us to bow hunting as their main example. Why is that considered so much more complex, techno-behaviorally speaking, than, say, napping a simple stone tool?
Well, the paper highlights a few key reasons. First, the gear itself is a system, almost like a machine. You've got the bow stave, the string, the arrow shaft, the arrowhead, maybe fletching, glue, potentially poison.
Lots of components.
Exactly. Each piece has to be made right, and they all have to work together perfectly. Second, and this is really crucial, there's what they call a protracted problem solution distance.
Unique.
Meaning you can't just grab some stuff and go hunt instantly. Making the bow, prepping the arrows, finding ingredients, and making the glue or poison that takes serious time.
Yep.
Often days, maybe weeks, before you even start the hunt itself.
Okay, so it's not just the manual skill, but the planning and the timing involved over that extended period, that foresight.
Precisely. It demands thinking ahead, managing resources, keeping track of multiple distinct steps that build on each other. This requires a higher cognitive load, just the mental effort needed to hold all those steps and parts in your mind and manage the whole sequence. The Kalahari ethnographies really bring this complexity to life.
Okay, so that's the behavior side, complex techno-behavior. Now, let's layer in the thinking side. Complex attention. What do they mean by that term?
So complex attention, as they define it, is basically our ability to actively control our focus, to shift it when needed, divide it between tasks, manipulate information in our heads, and sequence multiple steps to reach a goal.
That sounds like, well, like the kind of mental control we use all the time today.
It really is. It's that top-down executive control over where your attention goes. It lets us manage demanding tasks, filter distractions, plan ahead. Modern life absolutely relies on it.
And the paper argues this ability is tied, at least partly, to this specific brain region, the precuneus.
Yes. The thinking is, while sure, all hominins had attention skills, Homo sapiens developed this really distinct capacity for complex, controlled attention. Maybe Neanderthals were incredibly tuned into their immediate surroundings, their physical reality, but H. sapiens evolved maybe a greater capacity for introspection, for mental simulation, for managing attention across wider spans of time and space.
Which leads us into the brain itself, the precuneus. Where exactly is it, and why is it so central to this whole hypothesis?
So the precuneus is tucked away deep inside the parietal lobe, kind of towards the top and back of your brain. It's a major hub in the brain's attention networks. Specifically, it's part of the frontoparietal circuit that handles executive attention, that control system for your SOCUS we just mentioned.
So it's kind of like a central command center for directing our mental spotlight.
It plays a huge role in that, yeah. And its functions are really interesting and varied. It's involved in visuospatial processing, understanding where things are in space, how they relate, visual imaging, mental rotation, that kind of thing. Also, body cognition, our sense of our own body, where it is, how it's moving, how it interacts with the world.
That seems relevant for tool use.
Very relevant.
Yeah.
And crucially for this paper, it's linked to this idea of technological extension, how we perceive tools almost as extensions of our own bodies and capabilities. And also self-awareness, introspection, thinking about ourselves.
Wow, okay. It really sounds like a brain region perfectly placed to integrate all this information, our body, the tools in our hands, the environment around us, both near and far.
That's exactly the idea. And the core hypothesis here is that the development, the expansion maybe, of the H. sapiens precuneus might have been locked in this kind of coevolutionary feedback loop with complex bimanual techno-behaviors.
Meaning tasks needing coordinated use of both hands.
Right, alongside intense attention, sometimes across distance, like bow hunting.
Okay, so how do you even figure out if ancient bow hunting actually needed this specific, complex kind of attention? You can't exactly observe an ancient hunter. This is where looking at modern Kalahari bow hunting comes in, right? Using their practices as a sort of analogy.
Exactly. The paper analyzes these incredibly detailed observations of modern Kalahari hunters, breaking down the whole process from making the gear to the hunt itself, and identifies the specific types of attention demanded at each stage. It gives us a window into the likely cognitive requirements.
So let's walk through some examples from the source. Starting with just making the equipment, what kind of attention is needed just to craft the bow itself?
Well, even finding the right wood, that takes careful visual and selective attention. You can't just grab any stick. You need specific properties.
Right.
Then shaping the stave, that requires sustained focus, object-based attention, task-based attention, all happening right there in your immediate space, what they call peripersonal visuospatial attention.
Okay, but making the bowstring seems different, maybe more demanding.
It often is, yeah. It's usually made from spun sinew, two-ply. It's a continuous process. This needs focused executive control. You have to keep your attention locked on the task, ignore distractions, and critically divided by manual attention. Your hands are doing different but precisely coordinated actions at the same time.
You can't just stop halfway.
Pretty much. Stopping could ruin the string. So that's a really clear example of complex attention being applied intensely right there in your immediate personal space.
Okay, and then assembling all the parts.
That brings together visual attention, recalling from memory how the pieces fit, and that precise visual spatial focus in the space right around you. And some Kalahari hunters even tune the bow by plucking the string and listening to the pitch, so that adds auditory attention into the mix.
Fascinating. What about making the arrows, and especially the glue and the poison? The paper really seems to emphasize the cognitive load there.
Absolutely. I mean, grinding bone for arrowheads, that alone can take hours of sustained, focused work, similar to shaping the bow. But making the glue, say from Kadu lily bulbs, that's where it really ramps up.
How so?
Well, starting the fire with fire sticks, that needs intensely focused, bimanual peripersonal attention. Sometimes two people work together, which requires joint attention. It's a task where you really need uninterrupted focus.
And tending the fire, roasting the materials.
That demands high levels of executive control. Switching your attention between keeping the fire just right and preparing the next steps maybe divided attention managing different things simultaneously, plus careful visual monitoring. Then you've got pounding and kneading the pulp.
Okay.
And what's interesting here is you might be managing the fire while pounding the pulp. That means attending to processes happening both right near you, peripersonal, and maybe a bit further away, extrapersonal, at the same time.
Wow. And the poison, the source really stresses how dangerous that part is.
That's a critical point. Making poison, it demands intense introspective attention. You're constantly assessing the risk, weighing the danger of handling these materials against your motivation to hunt successfully. You need supreme executive control to block out all distractions.
Yeah, you can't afford to slip up.
Not at all. And you're managing visual attention, manipulating materials very carefully with both hands, focusing on the immediate space and the materials themselves, sometimes dealing with dangerous beetle grubs. It all requires divided attention. The potentially fatal outcome if you mess up provides really powerful evolutionary pressure for precise, controlled attention.
So it's clear, just the making process involves a whole suite of complex attention types. What about the hunt itself, the tracking, the stalking, the actual shooting?
Tracking is just a masterclass in sustained attention across distance. You're scanning the environment, sometimes for hours, interpreting these incredibly subtle signs on the ground. It heavily involves extrapersonal visual-spatial attention focusing out there.
And it's social too, right?
Deeply social. You're often using joint attention to read hand signals from your hunting partner, communicating about direction, speed, identifying the species from faint tracks, how old the tracks are.
Which means you're constantly fluently shifting and dividing your attention between the ground, the wider environment, your partner.
Exactly. Visual, executive, and selective attention are all critical for picking out the important cues from what might seem like a visually noisy background. And there's this constant state of alerting attention, just being ready for the animal to appear at any moment. Scouting, too, involves introspective attention, being aware of your own position, staying hidden, plus alertness and that extrapersonal focus, assessing herd dynamics from afar.
And then the final act, stalking and shooting the arrow.
This is probably the peak of attentional demand in the whole process. You're managing intense levels of multiple attention types simultaneously.
Like what?
Like introspective attention to control your own breathing, your movements. Executive attention to suppress the urge to move too quickly or make noise. Auditory attention for any subtle sounds. Social or joint attention if you're coordinating with a partner. Focused attention locked onto the target. And extrapersonal visuospatial attention, integrating the distant animal with your own position and the bow.
That's a lot to juggle mentally.
It is. You need incredible attentional timing, especially if hunters are shooting in tandem. It demands what archers today call quiet eye precision, that sustained, unwavering focus on the target across a distance, all while your hands are performing this complex bimanual task, operating the bow machine in your personal space. It's way beyond simpler tool use.
Okay. So the ethnographic analysis really seems to confirm that bow hunting, the whole system, genuinely pushes the boundaries of multiple attention types, often simultaneously or in rapid succession, integrating near space and far space.
It absolutely does. It functions as a complex techno-behavioral system that places significant demands on attentional control.
Right. Now let's connect this back to the brain and the genetics. How did the paper try to explore whether Homo sapiens had the sort of underlying hardware and software for this, especially compared to other ancient humans like Neanderthals?
So they took this neurogenetic approach, and they looked for genes that show high-frequency changes that seem unique to Homo sapiens compared to the available Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes. Then they checked if those genes are known today to be linked to attention and cognition phenotypes, and if they're highly expressed, specifically in the precuneus region of the brain. It's described as a heuristic first step, kind of exploratory, but it's a clever way to try and link genetics to potential cognitive function.
And what did they find when they looked at those specific genes, the ones changed in H. sapiens, linked to attention, and active in the precuneus?
Well, they started with a larger list, several hundred candidate genes fitting those criteria, and a significant chunk of these were already known to be associated with attention, with cognition, and many were highly expressed in the precuneus. They then narrowed it down to 42 genes that were specifically involved in neuronal function, directly linked to attention regulation today, and showed those unique H. sapiens genetic changes.
Okay, 42 key genes. And what was the crucial finding about those genes?
This is pretty striking. Every single one of them, all 42, 100% was associated with sustained attention.
Wow. All of them.
All of them. That ability to maintain focus over a long period and resist distractions, that's a really powerful correlation showing up in the data.
Were other types of attention strongly linked to those genes too?
Yes, very strongly. A very high percentage, over 75% in many cases, were also associated with executive attention, visuospatial attention, visual attention, attention switching, object or task-based attention, and social or joint attention. Basically, the genetic signature they identified pointed strongly towards that whole suite of complex attentional abilities we just talked about being necessary for bow hunting.
So, this preliminary genetic data, it suggests that the underlying biological capacity for this range of complex attention, maybe especially sustained focus, was locally different, potentially enhanced in African Homo sapiens compared to Neanderthals and Denisovans.
That's the tentative conclusion they draw, yes. It provides a potential neurogenetic underpinning for the cognitive differences that have been hypothesized based on archaeology and behavior.
Okay, let's try and weave all these threads together now through time. The behavior, the bow hunting, the brain, the precuneus, and the genes.
So we have archaeological evidence suggesting bow hunting technology, things like bone arrowheads, sometimes looking like types still used today, potentially with poison residues, might go back much further than people used to think, possibly over 60,000 years ago, maybe around 80,000 years ago in southern Africa. You see hints at sites like Classy's River, Sabutu Cave.
So not just a recent European thing.
Definitely not. It seems to be a technology that appears relatively early in Homo sapiens context in Africa and Asia, long before Europe.
And this rough time frame, say 60, 80,000 years ago, or maybe a bit earlier, overlaps with significant changes happening in the human skull shape, right?
It does seem to. Homo sapiens skulls become increasingly globular, rounder, starting perhaps around 160,000 years ago in Africa, reaching something like the modern shape range by maybe 100,000 years ago, and continuing to refine until about 35,000 years ago. And the shape change is partly driven by the expansion of brain areas like the parietal lobes.
Where the precuneus is located.
Exactly, where the precuneus sits.
So you've got this early evidence for complex bow hunting technology emerging around the same time window as the development of the modern human head shape, particularly involving the expansion of brain areas linked to complex attention.
And while the genetic timelines are always complex, and you have to account for things like ancient gene flow between populations, estimates for when some of these relevant gene changes in the precuneus might have become common also fall with this broad time frame. Some changes might be older, some more recent. The paper suggests it was likely a mosaic of evolutionary changes building up over time.
So the synthesis the paper proposes is that this confluence, the archaeological evidence for early complex bow hunting, the cranial evolution showing precuneus expansion, and these inferred genetic differences related to attention in the precuneus, they probably aren't just a coincidence.
Right. The core argument is that to successfully invent, master, use, and especially teach these complex techno-behaviors like bow hunting across generations, you likely needed the right cognitive software.
The neurogenetic configuration supporting complex attention.
Exactly. And that needed to be enabled by the right cranial hardware, an expanded, perhaps reorganized precuneus capable of integrating all that complex information. Body, tool, near space, far space, time.
And the paper mentions that modern brain imaging studies kind of back this up, showing the precuneus gets particularly active during complex tool use.
It does. Studies where people learn complex spatial tool tasks, like novices learning archery, show higher precuneus activation compared to when they do simpler tool tasks. This seems to reinforce the idea that the precuneus is really key for bringing together body awareness, visual attention, memory, and spatial planning, especially when you're coordinating complex actions across different distances.
Which suggests that this evolving precuneus in Homo sapiens could have really facilitated the ability to learn and teach these intricate bimanual skills, potentially setting up that socio-technical co-evolutionary feedback loop you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. It's this dynamic interplay. As H. sapiens' brains developed greater capacity for complex attention, perhaps through these changes in the precuneus, they could develop and master more complex technologies like bow hunting. Then, successfully using and teaching these technologies, which themselves demand high levels of complex attention, would create selective pressure. It would favor individuals and maybe groups with stronger capabilities in these areas.
Which could then further shape the precuneus and the underlying genetics over generations.
Exactly. Technology driving brain evolution and brain evolution enabling more complex technology.
And the underlying implication is that while other ancient humans, like Neanderthals, were undoubtedly intelligent and highly skilled in their own ways,
Absolutely.
Homo sapiens might have developed this unique aptitude for integrating body awareness, tool use, and attention across significant distances and over extended periods of time. An aptitude that was essential for bow hunting success and potentially beneficial for many other complex human behaviors, too.
That's the hypothesis presented in the paper, yeah. Different evolutionary trajectories leading perhaps to different cognitive strengths and emphasis.
Of course, the paper is quite clear that this is, a first step, and there are limitations to this kind of study.
Oh, absolutely. The genetic work especially is described as heuristic. Comparing ancient DNA is incredibly complex. The data sets are still quite limited, especially for deep time periods. And gene expression data in specific brain regions like the precuneus often comes from limited modern samples.
And they acknowledge other brain regions are obviously involved too, right? Like the cerebellum, which is crucial for motor control and learning.
Yes, that's mentioned as needing further study. As are other types of genetic changes, like those affecting gene regulation, not just the protein coding bits they focused on here. And disentangling whether a gene linked to a phenotype today was linked in the same way due to the specific H. sapiens mutations. That's complex too.
So definitely a starting point that opens up a lot of questions for future research to really test and refine these ideas.
For sure, it's provocative work.
Okay, so let's try and pull it all together then. If you had to summarize the big takeaway from this deep dive into the source material, what would it be?
I think the evidence presented weaves together this really profound, intertwined evolutionary story. It suggests that the ability of Homo sapiens to engage in truly complex techno-behaviors, like early bow hunting, seems deeply linked to unique adaptations in our brain, specifically involving the expansion and the neurogenetic makeup of the precuneus.
Okay.
This brain region appears fundamentally connected to our capacity for complex, top-down attentional control, particularly things like sustained attention, ignoring distractions, and sophisticated visuospatial processing, integrating our actions and perceptions across both the space right around us and the world far away.
And it really paints this picture of human technological development and our brain evolution kind of pushing each other forward in a feedback loop.
Exactly. As our ancestors faced increasing socio-technical challenges, maybe opportunities too, perhaps around 100,000 years ago or even earlier, there could have been significant evolutionary pressure favoring those individuals whose neurogenetic setups supported a more capable precuneus.
Right.
And this enhanced capability, in turn, would have unlocked the potential for inventing, mastering, and transmitting increasingly complex technologies and maybe even social structures, which then further shaped our minds over millennia.
It makes you think, connecting back to today. The paper's ideas suggest that your ability right now to focus on something distant while maybe manipulating controls right in front of you, think about driving a car or aiming in sports or even just juggling multiple windows on your computer screen.
Yeah.
That ability might be rooted in the very same neural machinery, the same precuneus functions that were potentially honed tens of thousands of years ago by our ancestors needing to precisely aim an arrow at a distant animal while coordinating their body in this complex weapon system in their hands.
It's a fascinating connection, isn't it? What does that tell you, listening right now, about the deep, deep evolutionary history embedded in your own everyday capacity for focused, complex attention? And maybe how intimately your mind is actually wired to interact with tools in the world around you across every distance. Something to think about.